Hey guys, in this episode of On the Line, we are speaking with retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, United States Army, someone who has been a career soldier, an analyst, an educator, a healthcare professional. He's kind of done it all. I'll tell you the story in a minute, but he and I became connected through kind of a weird series of coincidences. And on a whim, I invited him on, and to my pleasure, he said yes. The general is going to talk with me about his diagnosis of what's happening in American politics, what frustrations the Americans and the Allies should have with each other, what it will take for that breach to be healed, and also leadership, family, values, what makes a person who they are. My conversation with Lieutenant General retired Mark Hertling right here. It's On the Line. So, funny thing happened. Last fall, I was at the Halifax International Security Forum, and I wrote a column where I described a dinner I was at. It was Chatham House Rule. I cannot tell you who was there or what was said, but I can tell you in general terms, it was a mixture of weirdos like me, former senior American government officials, and senior Allied military officers. And normally I do not swear on the Line. We get our swears out of the way on the Line podcast, but I will tell you the exact quote that became the headline of the column I wrote about the dinner. The former American officials were talking about what it will be like when Mr. Trump is no longer in office or the midterms have curtailed his power. And the America that these former officials had known comes back. And they were reassuring us, don't worry, Trump is temporary. We'll be back. We'll be back soon. It'll be business as usual. And this senior Allied military officer looked across the table at these American officials and said, yeah, but we'll never fucking trust you again. That column ended up becoming one of the Line's most successful, most well-read columns ever. And a few months ago, a Line reader sent me a YouTube link and said, hey, Matt, I don't know if you know Mark Hertling. He's a U.S. retired military officer, and he's a commentator, and he's seen him a bunch of different places. But in a speech he recently gave that I watched, he was talking about your article. He was responding to it. And I watched the speech, and I liked it. And I thought to myself, you know what? I wonder if I can find this guy's email address, and I'll just pop him a line, and I'll say, come on, and we'll talk about it. And I did. And I did. And he did. So what you are about to hear now is the product of me going to a conference, writing an article, the general seeing the article and working it into one of his speeches, and then us chatting about what some of those issues were. We're also going to talk a little bit about his book. Go to readtheline.ca. In the description for this episode, you will find a link to his book. I encourage you to check it out. But for right now, here is my conversation with retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling of the United States Army on America, the Allies, and the state of the world. Well, General, great to have you here. And I read your CV, I've looked at your LinkedIn, and I'm not going to even try and tell people about your career. Do you want to tell me and the listeners and the viewers, who are you? What did you do, and why are we talking today?
Yeah, well, my name is Mark Hertling. I'm a retired Lieutenant General from the U.S. Army. My last job was the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, where we not only trained our own forces of about 60,000, but we also work with the allies of 49 different countries, to include the 30 NATO countries that are in Europe. Spent a couple of years in combat on different occasions, commanded the U.S. 1st Armored Division during the surge. So my background is mostly military. I retired in 2013, and since then I've worked in healthcare for about 10 years, doing a variety of different things, but specifically as an additional duty, I train doctors and nurses and administrators how to be better leaders, and use that as part of a doctoral dissertation with some research, where I got my doctorate as an old man of 63, older than all the professors and all the students that were in the classroom with me, which was kind of a fun, but I learned an awful lot. Over the last couple of years, I've been freelancing. Oh, and by the way, I worked for CNN for 10 years too, from 2013 to 2024, being their military analyst. Left there last 2 Decembers ago and been doing a lot of freelance stuff and also teaching at a college here in a business school here in Orlando. A wonderful wife of 51 years, 2 boys, 7 grandkids, and living large here in Florida. So that's a summary of my elevator speech there, Matt.
Well, you know what? It's funny. I remember you because I've been covering defense affairs for almost 20 years, and I certainly remember you from some of your time in uniform during the surge and your CNN work after. But I first noticed you on social media because you were complaining about the St. Louis Blues, and as a Leafs fan, I get it. And I remember thinking, "Hey, I know that guy from TV." And then, oh, he also has hockey frustrations. So I began following you a long time ago. Um, you and I are talking today because of something interesting. I was at the Halifax, and I've already set this up for the listeners before you come on, General, so I'll be brief here. But I was at the Halifax International Security Forum in November, and it was an interesting one because of a Pentagon directive. There aren't many Americans who are still showing up at these things, but there were some. And I thought watching how they were interacting with their allies was interesting. And I wrote a column or maybe a reported analysis piece just about what it was like listening to how European allies in particular and Americans were talking to each other. And then a few months later, one of my readers sent me a speech that you had given where you made reference to the article I wrote. And this reader said, "Hey, you should just email the general and invite him on." And I thought to myself, well, he's probably a busy guy. He probably won't have time for me. Luckily, I was wrong, so it's nice to have you here. The headline, and I don't normally swear on the podcast, but it's a direct quote, so I'm just going to tell you what it was. It was a senior Allied officer who told a now former American official, "We will never fucking trust you again." And that was because the American official at a Chatham House Rule event. So
Yeah.
I can tell you what they said, but not who they were. But they had been a long-standing State Department official, and they had said, "Mr. Trump is a passing trend. He won't last forever. Don't worry, allies, we'll be back." And then this senior Allied military officer says, "If you show up tomorrow, we're not going to trust you."
Yeah.
You picked up on that line from my column, and you worked it into a speech you were giving. Let me just ask you directly, what's your response to that? When you hear Allied officials saying that we won't trust America again, what's your reaction?
Well, it seems that way, Matt. And I'm really glad you reached out to me because when I read your article, it was right after I read Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos, which I thought was fascinating because it really described the change in the tide. I probably should start off by saying I am an eternal optimist, and I'm a true believer in the experiment that our country has made over the last 250 years, and which your country has made too, in terms of self-rule, democracies, a representative government, rule of law, freedom, but at the same time, social interactions and dynamics. So I'm troubled by what I'm seeing happening in the United States right now. And in fact, I just finished a piece with a streaming piece with the Bulwark talking about what the president just said in describing at the White House what happened in the recovery of the 2 pilots. And even that distressed me. It was a terrific military mission, but I'm very concerned at the way some of the people wearing civilian suits in our government are playing fast and loose with some of our institutions. So with that as kind of the lead in, what I'll now say is when I first read your piece, I thought, oh my gosh, that's what the world is thinking of us. And I had been asked to give a presentation at the Principal First Conference in Washington, and I said, I want to use this speech or this article, the Americans ain't going to be back or ain't going to be fucking back or however the headline was, and use it as a way to counter it and to give people a little bit of energy to try and focus on the future, that we could come back. And what I did in the speech was say, first of all, how right you and others were, in proclaiming that, and how we have lost a lot of trust. I still travel a lot in my old stomping grounds of Europe, and I was in the Nordic and Baltic area last summer. And it seemed like in the early days of the Trump administration, those were the same feelings that a lot of our really hardcore allies were saying. You see the intelligence communities kind of falling apart because they don't want to share things with us because they don't trust that the information will be protected based on several things. You see, in some cases, the militaries of our allies and us are still working together because we always have done that, and you trust each other at a different level when you're wearing the uniform. But even that's starting to bend and almost break a little bit now too, because of some of the things we're doing, from contingency plans to bombing boats to going into a country without sharing any thoughts with our allies. So that's a long lead in to say, I used your words to say we will be back, but only if we do certain things. If we become a lot more humble as a nation, that if we return to the values that we claim to proclaim and that we share with like-minded democracies, and if we start talking to one another the way it used to be as opposed to the way it is now. And I use the example of nations that are good nations today, that were good nations in the past, but suffered through a time period where everything ran counter to what they said they believed. And I use the example of Germany during World War I, or excuse me, Germany during World War I and World War II, and Japan during World War II. And said, and I also gave a nod to Vietnam as well. So I think that if we get a bunch of people believing that we won't be back to what we used to be, but in fact, we could come back a little bit better, we have that opportunity. Now, that's a grand optimist view of the world and life that I'm not sure is going to happen, but that's what I'm going to stand by.
I never argue with an optimist, right? Like anyone who can muscle up the courage and the strength to remain an optimist is made of tougher stuff than I am. So I never try to change their minds. Let me tell you what I think. I love America and I love Americans. And that's sometimes a taboo thing for Canadians to say, but I've never been shy about it. I think America is the greatest civilization the world has ever known. I also think you guys have gone bonkers. And it could be cyclical. It could just be something that has to happen to great civilizations every now and then. But the problem is, I think it was a French official who said we can't trust our defense on 10,000 voters in Wisconsin every 4 years, right? And one of the things I found really frustrating is that I've been calling for almost my entire career for my country, but the allies generally, to be masters in their own house, to take defense seriously, to be contributing more so that America didn't have to do so much of the heavy lifting. And no one listened. It was just, the Americans will defend us. We can go spend all our money on other things. And there was a real arrogance among Canadians, but also some of the other allies, that you would just keep doing what you'd been doing forever. And then one day you stopped, or at least began saying you would do it differently. And I just think the incredible tragedy of it is, I think Americans are the best people in the world, the most generous and the most giving and the most dynamic. But until you kind of decide for yourselves what you want to be and what you want to do as a country, all the other countries that used to depend on you are going to have to look at you guys kind of funny. And, 80 years of accumulated goodwill after the Second World War, in some cases even longer. General, how long does it take to get that back?
Yeah, it's gonna. Yeah, I've thought about that too, Matt, and that's a great question. It's going to take more than a generation, I think. I mean, it took the Germans. My first assignment as a young lieutenant was in Germany in 1975, and there were parts of the city I was stationed in, Schweinfurt, that was still dealing with the repercussions of a war that had occurred 20 years prior to that, 30 years prior to that. I don't know, but I would. It's not going to happen quickly. And that's part of, I think, the problem too, if I can say this, because my fellow citizens here in the United States are extremely impatient. And if what if my optimistic view of the next 6 months and the next 2 years and 6 months, when elections are reheld and people start realizing what they've done to themselves, if they immediately think that everything's going to turn and suddenly go back to normal, they're crazy. It's not. There's going to be a whole lot of people still wearing red hats and saying elections were stolen. I don't know. I can't put my finger on how long it's going to take, but I think it's going to take a long time, if that's descriptive. And I also have been struggling with what kind of a leader is going to pull us through this. What is going to be the qualities and attributes and the character of a leader that can really step up and not only counter all the things that have been going on during the last year plus, but also provide a new vision and a new direction with certainly our same aspirations that we've always had as a nation, but getting us back on track. I don't know.
One of the things that worries me, and again, I say this as an admirer of and friend to America. I was just down in Florida a couple days ago. The tan fades quickly, but I promise I was there.
Yeah.
I don't know if the American public realizes how much America itself benefited from the world America built. And, I understand better than I think most of America's allies why Americans were frustrated with a lack of commitment and effort on defense matters from a lot of the allies. But I also understand that America benefited. Even from an imperfect arrangement, it still brought benefits.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that Americans are an impatient people. I kind of like that about you guys because you get things done. But I am going to say there may come a time, and I think you might already be running into a little bit, where European nations are, closing bases and airspace and things like that. And that's happened before. I know it happened with Libya and other things. I know it's not unprecedented. But that's just an example of the kind of soft political and cultural and economic power that America's had since 1945.
Right.
And certain people in play in America right now in politics or society, they don't know about it. They don't care about it. They've probably had it so long they forgot it was there. But I don't know what America is going to do to come back from this. And I agree with you that you will try, because I think fundamentally you are good and decent people. But I mean, anyone who's ever been deeply disappointed in a friend before, the love can remain, but the trust can take a long time to come back. And you got to act differently.
It's funny you should say that, because in the speech I gave that someone alerted you to, I had an example late in the speech about dysfunctional marriages where either the husband or the wife cheats on the other one. And that's kind of what we've done to the world. We've cheated on the world. We said we believe these certain things, and yet we're not showing them. So, if you talk to anyone that's been in a adulterous relationship, in some cases, very few, the wife or the husband will forgive the cheating partner, and they will actually form a better marriage. But in the vast majority of cases, it's a split that is a divorce that never returns to the way it was or better. So I think that is probably a much better analogy. But a couple of people told me I shouldn't be talking about adulterous people in a speech to the Principal First Conference, and they were right. So I'm sharing it with you, but it was sort of the best analogy I could think of.
I think you're right, but I would say, and I feel like I'm coming to your defense now, we weren't a great spouse either. Like, we also made promises we didn't live up to. And I think I think all the allies needed marriage counseling. I think we all could have been doing a better job, but I also think I share a lot of the frustrations that a lot of Americans do with the commitment from the allies, but I also think the way the administration, the White House, has gone away addressing this, I think they had a valid point in some ways. I also think they've responded in the most destructive way they could have imagined.
Yeah.
And, someone had asked me a few days ago, well, what would you have done? I said, I don't mind the idea of tariffs. You go, hey, allies that are under the spending target, we're going to tariff you and we're going to get you back. You can either spend on defense or you can pay a tariff. There are ways to apply pressure, but like threatening to annex Greenland in my country probably wasn't the way to do it. And I want to ask you a different question. Based on your contacts in the alliance, but also in the United States, if there is going to be a better marriage after, and maybe there's not, but if there is going to be one, let's be optimists here. What do you think America needs to do? But what do you think the allies need to do? What do you want to see from Canada and Europe? Or what do you think would help? How do we bring this warring couple back together, for the children?
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. If I could just add one more thing, and the reason why I'm so optimistic, it's because I get to teach young people. And for the last 4 years, because I'm class of 1975 from West Point, and West Point has a program they call the affiliation program, where the class of 50 years past works with the class that's in session now. So for the last 4 years, my class has worked with the class of 25. And what I saw in those 1,000+ young cadets who are now graduated and pinning on the second lieutenant's bars, they're damn good. I mean, they are much better than I ever was, and they have a great vision for the future. So I think part of our, I hate to use the word exceptionalism, can only be pulled back if we realize that education is a principal part of it. The second thing is we have become too dependent. Our nation has become too dependent on our military. And I think we could take lessons from other NATO partners and saying, hey, diplomacy should probably be the priority of any kind of international relations, and military should be the last resort. But because we showed our primacy in the military, in the profession of arms during Desert Storm, we've had a series of politicians who have put us in the first use category. And I think that's dangerous in and of itself, because it runs counter to what good societies do. To get to your question about what should allies do, man, I tell you, I mean, and I'm limited on this to Europe, because that's where I spent a good portion of my career. And with the exception of one or two allies that just were extremely selfish in their approach, I saw, of the 49 countries I dealt with in Europe, 46 or 47 of them that really wanted to work and play well together. I can't think of anything that I would recommend to our allied nations. Now, the focus of attention has been on the percentage of GDP spent on defense. Well, I mean, I'm not sure I want some of the NATO allies to spend 2% or 3%, or as the president said, 5%. Hell, we don't spend 5%. We spent 3.7% on average over the last 40 years, and we have a worldwide force. So if you're talking about what was my budget in Europe as the army commander over there, I know some of the other nations had a budget much higher than mine for their army in Europe. So they were doing probably a whole lot better than we were in that regard. There is no one that's meeting that 5% that President Trump keeps touting. The closest one, and only one close to it, is Poland, and they're like at 4.1%.
Yeah.
So it's, we got to be careful in how we lie. And by the way, I also don't want Luxembourg spending 5% of their, GDP on military, because you're going to get a bunch of guys in really nice uniforms in a very small country that has a lot of banks. So again, it's common sense. What do you want from other nations, and how do they contribute? And that whole effort in terms of the percentage of GDP started in 2014 when we recommended it. And most of the nations said, yeah, you're probably right, we should give more. They were slow in doing it, and that gave the current president a talking point.
When you mentioned, I have one more question for you. You've also written a book, and I want to talk with you about that because I want to learn a little bit more about what you're sharing there. But you mentioned the young cadets and future officers that or I
Yeah.
guess officers now, I guess if it's class
Yeah.
25, but that you'd been working with. And one of the things that I do find reassuring is how there are certain fights that seem to be the hobbies of older people that younger people just don't care about.
Right.
And
Yeah.
General, you have a couple of years on me, but I'm old enough now to have begun looking at people who are legally and morally adults and rolling my eyes at their youth and naivete. So I guess I'm turning into a middle-aged man at the very least. But one of the things I actually do think, one of the reasons I am an optimist on America is that I do think the youth get it. And I think they've grown up in a different world. And I think it's a more connected world. And I think there's a real desire to see new things and meet new people. What I worry about, you said before, it could take a generation for trust to be rebuilt. What does Western security look like a generation from now if one of our operating assumptions for that generation is that every 2 to 4 years, America just might take its ball and go home? We're looking right now at Europe here. I think it's great that the Europeans are actually kind of get their defense industry and their forces in a better state. They live in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood. They should be getting their act together. I think that's great. I just worry about what happens when a generation goes by and Washington and Brussels might not be talking to each other much.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about that too, and you're right. Um, the thing that I thought, eh, having watched it for so many years, the reason why I think the United States was so critical to Europe is because, you know, we were like-minded, but we didn't have a dog in the fight of the centuries-old taking each other's countries. I mean, we were kind of the outsiders saying, "Come on, can't you guys play a little bit better together?" And Canada was right along with us on that. So that in and of itself, I think, was critically important because we could stand off a little bit with a great amount of power and say, "Let's try and form, what we really want to do and provide a grander vision." So. It, Putting it back on the onus of the Europeans to do that, I mean, the European Union is a much more mature organization than it ever has been before. So maybe that's a possibility. But the connective tissue between our two countries and Europe, I think, is still important. And that's going to be one of the things we have to get back to in probably a very different way.
You
We're gonna
mentioned
probably, you and us, your country and our country are probably going to be seen as the outsiders that we weren't seen as before in the coming decades. And by the way,
I know.
when you were talking a little bit, when you were describing this problem, Matt, you sounded pretty much like an optimist to me.
You know what? It peaks out occasionally before I kind of like smash it down again and get a lid
Yeah.
on it because it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
You mentioned just kind of the different experience. I mean, my first three ancestors who actually came to Canada were three brothers, and they ended up on farms that were further apart from each other than most European imperial wars had been fought.
Right.
And like family visits would be like marching an army from like Prussia to like the Atlantic coast because I mean, they could do it, but it was hard. So yeah, the North American experience is radically different. And to your point about Canada and the US ending up being the outsiders, you're right. And that's something Canadians are realizing because I don't know if we want to be outside of Europe until America settles down a bit. We want to be closer to those guys for a while.
I'm with you.
So,
I'm with you there. And we've considered moving to Canada too because we really like Canadians. Here's the thing I think is going to be interesting. Whoever is the next president who's going to have this load put into their rucksack, there's always a debate on where a new president should go first on their international trip. And it's usually either the UK or France or, I think the first trip the next president should go to is Canada. They should go to your capital and say, how do we do this together a little bit better? Because we have so much more in common than a lot of other nations. And I personally think we could learn a whole lot from Canadians' charisma and their ways of doing things.
Well, we could learn a little bit from you guys as well. So maybe we meet in the middle and hammer something out. General, you'd mentioned to me you've got another interview coming up, so I don't want to burn too much of your time, but you did write a book, and I know you've been thinking about a lot of these issues. You mentioned leadership in particular.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, what's the book about? What, like, why? Well, first of all, why did you decide to torture yourself and write a book?
Well,
And like, was it for your sins? And then, what was it actually about?
no, I was forced to do it, and I'll tell you the story in a minute. I think you'll like the story, but one thing I ought to comment on, I think we ought to meet when Canada and the United States meet, we ought to meet somewhere in either Detroit or Ottawa for a hockey game and have a
Hmm?
hockey game summit. What do you think of that?
You know what? Detroit works for me. It's 4 hours down the road, and they've really cleaned up downtown, and the restaurants are
Yeah,
much improved. So
yeah.
Detroit will work.
All right, the book here, the book cover looks like this, and the title of it is "If I Don't Return." And it's based on what happened during Desert Storm when I was a young major. We were told, I was in the 1st Armored Division in a cavalry squadron, and we were told we were probably going to suffer 50% casualties because I won't go into the reasons why because it's too long of a story, but it seemed viable that we would suffer. So we had 2 young sons at the time, 7 and 10 years old. And I realized that if I just had a coin flip of returning home, I should probably leave some lessons for my 2 boys. So I started keeping a journal, a daily journal. And it wasn't about the war initially. It was just about things a dad wants to teach their sons, emotions, fear, love, how to find a good mate, how to be a good person of character, those kind of things. But then when we got into the war and we were under a lot of, we had some pretty harsh combat actions. When it was over, when the 4-day campaign was over, I wrote about that too. And then we were there for an additional couple of months, and I wrote about the post-war effects as well. Well, here, the spoiler alert, Matt, is that I survived, and I did come home actually, which you probably already realized.
I
But
had a hunch.
the the boys were still 7 and 10, and they weren't interested in my musings about life. So I threw this journal into a footlocker and never to be seen again. Well, about 3 years ago, our youngest son, both of our sons, by the way, have served in the military and gone against my hopes and dreams that they would never have to serve in combat because both of them have more deployments than I do. Uh, our youngest son asked my wife where the journal was. And what he did, unbeknownst to me, is he typed it up in a Word document, inserted some pictures. And then in a Christmas morning of 2024, when all the other presents were done, it was just him and I sitting in the living room. He came up to me with a box and presented it to me and said, "Dad, he said, my brother and I realized what you were doing. You were trying to prepare us if you didn't come home." He said, "But you did, and you had 35 more years of experience in the military and in other things. Why don't you continue this journal for your grandsons?" Um, and he said, "You've got a lot to tell them that's part of our history." So what I did, Matt, is I took each journal entry in the book, and each journal entry is probably a page long, but I did a reflection on that same subject on what I had learned since. And to include my time in the Army and how many changes had taken place and what we had done and different deployments and different types of combat than Desert Storm. A chapter on cultures and meeting people all over the world, that kind of stuff. And um, it was not a pain at all to do. Most books are a pain, but I had an automatic outline for the book because it was in the journal entry subjects. I sent it to a couple of people and they said, "You ought to get this published." So I did. And it's actually become very interesting. It's an Amazon bestseller now, and it would be perfect for Father's Day or graduation or whatever you want to give. And so that's my book pitch. And it's been fun to do it, and it's reconnecting me with a bunch of old friends, which is fun too, because they read about themselves in the book as well.
I will drop a link to it when we release this podcast. And I'll mention you, General, and we've only got a couple of minutes left here, and I promise I'm not going to get too emotional here, but my listeners and viewers know this. My family got a really bad health diagnosis a few months ago. It's my wife. She's battling something quite serious, and we've been thinking exactly kind of what you were doing here. Like, what do you want to write down? And in a worst case scenario, what do you want the kids to know? Our kids are a bit older than yours were. Our situation is a little better than it looked a few months ago, but it's tough. And we joke about optimism. I'm an optimist sometimes, but sometimes optimism is hard.
Yeah.
And what would be something, not to your sons or your grandson or our kids, because my wife is thinking, my oldest is a daughter. And my wife's thinking, what do I want her to know? What do I wish my mom had told me in case I'm not here to have those conversations at big moments in her life? And I think there's a chance she will be, but there's a chance she won't be. What do you want America to know? And what do you want Canada to know? Like, you're a general, you're a husband, you're a father, you're a grandfather, and I'll bring this whole conversation full circle here. We're going through some weird stuff. It's been the stories I've covered in the last 5 or 10 years of my career, nothing I ever imagined I would have to be reporting on. And I've joked about this with my business partner here. It's at the point where I wake up in the morning and I look at the headlines that have come out the other night, and I just shake my head and I go make a cup of tea. Like, I can't even believe the stuff that is just normalized now. If you could leave a message, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, and I apologize for that, but what do you want people to know? I mean, you travel the world, you talk to people about leadership. What do you tell them?
Well, I tell them that leadership is based on 4 different things that I didn't know until I went off and studied it. I was applying it over a decade, but I had never really truly studied it. It's based on your attributes, who you are as a person and what you know, and how you have to constantly learn and grow and create those attributes, polish the diamond. There's a chapter in the book. I bet a jeweler who talked to me about diamond polishing and how difficult it was on an airplane flight back from Germany one time. And I thought I was going to sleep on that plane, but what he told me about polishing a diamond is something we should do, not only for ourselves, in continual self-assessment of our character and who we are and how we present ourselves and how we learn new things every day, but it's also in the competencies that you have, not just in your job and your profession, but how you make your family life and your professional life, if you're a man, because that's a primary focus of most men is their professional life. How do you make those things live in harmony? How you are as a husband, a father, a dad, a good person versus how you are doing whatever it is you do for your business and for your money. But then there's also of how do you influence people? How do you inspire people? You can't motivate other people. You can only find out what their motivations are and determine how you can influence them in a positive way. And then finally, there's an area, the 4th area is context. What things are you, what positions are you put in? What requirements are asked of you? And it causes you to change your perspective. So those are the leadership things, but I think it all really flows back to your individual character. What are your values? What's your background and how does it affect you? And what do you want other people to know about you? I teach this MBA class, Matt, where I ask the question on the very first day, what are your values? And they all look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you talking about? Well, what are the things you believe in? What causes you to make decisions one way or another? And people don't assess that in themselves all that much. So just having that time to reflect on what you believe and why you believe it is an interesting, dynamic to take on. The other thing that I'd say is it kind of relates to what you said. This is a big, beautiful world. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, where the Blues play, and I had never left there until I was 18 years old, had never been on a plane. And since then, I've been to 123 different countries. I've been lucky enough to do that. I've had dinner with presidents and kings and privates and sergeants and civilians. And what I've seen as I travel all around the world is if you get to know people and truly come to understand them, you don't have any biases. Because all people want the same kinds of things, they just do it differently. Those are the things And I'm sorry, I should have started off by saying it's unfortunate that your family is going through this. I will think of you and pray for your wife. But just the fact that you can reflect on what it means to be a good person, and if you can pass that along to your family and to anybody else who's interested, that's part of living a good life. What do you leave behind?
One of the ironies of it is I think I became the person I am because of her.
Yeah, me too, with my wife. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have been a pretty rotten guy if I hadn't met this short little blonde girl that I dated a long time ago. Yeah.
Well, I think you and I have some things in common then, at least in terms of our taste. But yeah, General, thank you for this. I really appreciate your time. Maybe we can talk again sometime and kind of check in and see how we're all doing. But for now, I'm really grateful for this. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it today.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Well, folks, that was my conversation with Mark Hertling. Many, many thanks to him, the Lieutenant General, United States Army, retired now, commanded U.S. Army forces in Europe. So obviously he's kind of relevant to what's been happening lately. Just as a heads up to you, this was recorded around the Easter long weekend, so we did not attempt to stay at the very tippy top of the news events going on in the Persian Gulf. Obviously, we allude to it, but by the time this was recorded and would be edited and released, we weren't sure it would still be the most topical thing, so we didn't even try to be. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you do want to pick up a copy of the General's book, like I said, www.readtheline.ca. Find this episode of On the Line. I'll have a link in there going to where you can find a copy of the General's book. Other than that, like and subscribe. My thanks to the General. My thanks to you. We'll be back on Friday with another episode of the Line Podcast. Take good care.